Hi, and welcome to the third of my videos on myths of landscape photography. And this one addresses the issue of how to achieve optimum exposure and questions the suggestion that this is best achieved by using the manual mode. And I think this really comes about from the ways in which we had to adjust exposure back in the days of film and possibly the early days of digital photography. Now, cameras mostly have three modes for exposure calculation. Three metering modes: spot metering for a very limited region of the scene, center weighted, which is a somewhat wider area, and then matrix or evaluative metering, which attempts to assess the whole of the scene to establish the optimum exposure. Now, the way in which you'd use those back in the day of film and early days of digital was that the camera, using the exposure mode that you selected, would show up on the screen a scale from probably 0 to -3, 0 to +3, indicating whether you had what the camera considered was perfect exposure or whether you were over or underexposed. And with no other aids to exposure other than that and experience, you would typically choose the exposure mode that best suited the scene you were taking, and you would adjust either aperture or the shutter speed, depending on the mode you were using, to get that scale to the 0 point indicating perfect exposure. Now, with digital cameras, both DSLRs with live view and mirrorless, you now have the option or the facility of using a histogram, so that not only do you have to use the exposure measuring facilities of your camera, you can actually intervene to adjust that exposure before you press the shutter to actually adjust that exposure to exactly where you want. Previously, in earlier digital cameras, you'd have to take the picture, look at the histogram afterwards, and then go back and take a second shot with some degree of adjustment made. Now, if you're going to adopt that approach, i.e. to rely on the histogram and possibly things like zebra stripes to indicate areas of the scene that are overexposed, then it becomes somewhat less important whether you use spot metering or whether you use evaluative metering, because ultimately you're going to be looking at the histogram and deciding where you want that to be and adjusting the exposure to get the histogram balance of tones to be how you feel they should be for that scene. Now, that means it really doesn't make a great deal of difference whether you use manual exposure or aperture priority. Now, I'm going to concentrate on aperture priority because, as I said in the earlier video in the sequence, generally you choose aperture priority for landscape photographs because you are trying to make an aesthetic judgment of how much depth of field you want in your image. So, assuming that you're going to control your aperture and you're going to fix your ISO probably at the base level to get maximum detail out of your sensor, then you're going to be controlling the shutter speed, or the camera is going to be controlling the shutter speed. And the question is, does it matter whether the camera does it or you do it? Well, it suggests that with modern digital cameras, the hybrid approach is best, simply because it's fastest. Yes, you can set your aperture, set your ISO, and then in manual mode, adjust your shutter speed until your histogram is as you want it to be. That's fine. You can also do it with aperture priority auto exposure, and now in this case the camera chooses the shutter speed. Now, the only advantage this has is it will get you 90% of where you need to be quickly. It may not get it right, it may not get it as accurate as your chosen manual exposure, but it gets you there quickly, and you can then use exposure compensation to do the final tweaking. The end result is going to be the same. One is not inherently better than the other, but I would suggest that auto exposure with subsequent exposure compensation is quicker, it's less hassle, and particularly if you're hand holding, it's easier to implement. And again, if you're using a DSLR with live view and you don't have a tilting screen, again, it will be much easier to let the camera do most of the adjustments before you make the final tweaks. So hopefully I'll at least have persuaded you to try, if you've been persuaded to use manual, try using aperture priority with exposure compensation as an alternative, because I think there's a good chance you'll find it quicker and more convenient. You certainly shouldn't find that the results you achieve are in any way inferior to a fully manual mode. Before I finish, I just want to comment on histograms. Now, histograms aren't absolute. A histogram isn't based on the raw data your sensor is collecting. A histogram is based on the JPEG that your camera creates for that purpose. Even if you're shooting in RAW, the camera will create an embedded JPEG that it uses for metering purposes. Now, camera manufacturers tend to be a little conservative with that conversion because they don't want people blowing out highlights. It tends to lead to criticism of the camera. So what you may find with experience is there is more information in the scene than you're getting from the JPEG. And so with experience you may find that you can overexpose slightly on the basis of what the histogram's telling you, because there will still be data left coming from the sensor that you will be able to pull out in post-processing of your raw file that will give you greater dynamic range. So that's something to bear in mind. Modern cameras are much better than earlier cameras. I had a Nikon D200 which was very conservative, and I always set whatever approach I was taking to metering, I always dialed in 0.7 plus 0.7 of a stock compensation before I started, because I knew that the camera would underexpose otherwise. So hopefully you found this interesting. Hopefully I've persuaded you to that you don't have to use manual exposure, because as with the other videos, the point here is trying to remove barriers, trying to remove things that will prevent you from taking photos, enjoying the experience and growing from learning from the results you achieve. So again, hope you found this interesting. Thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.